Welcome to today's Politics and Tactics. We got a special guest for you today, Curt Varone, the John Turley of the fire department. He gives great legal advice. He's a great lawyer. He's doing some great things. And he's one of the few people that I'd pick up the phone if I got a question. I was just talking to him, texting back and forth the other night saying, what happened to the left? The left used to be for free speech. So what do you call it? This is the guy. This show, I'm going to pass it over to PJ. PJ is going to be the lead on this show. I do have some questions for our great attorney, but Curt, we really appreciate you coming on. And like I said, out of everybody all the people that say they're firehouse attorneys, you're the guy I would go to. So PJ.
Yeah, absolutely. You're the real attorney, Chief. And we appreciate you once again, kind of giving us your time. Frank got caught up a little bit there like I normally do. We're actually pre-recording today's show. So if you are watching and you ask us questions, we apologize that we're not answering. But we pre-recorded this at a time that met everybody's schedule. But feel free to either send Frank or I or even the Chief an email or hit us up on social media with any questions that you may have after the fact. And we'll do our best to get back to you with an answer or point you in the right direction. So today's show or tonight's show, whenever you're watching this, is interesting because we all have questions. We're not looking to yell fire in the movie theater. We're not looking to kind of get everybody all riled up and fired up, which a lot of you already are on this topic. We're looking to make sure that you're aware of some things that are going on and encourage you to do your research, encourage you to read the documents and inform yourself of a proposed change in the OSHA 1910-156 standard that we all know as the fire brigade standard. OSHA has published a proposed rule, which means that this isn't the final rule. It's proposed, and we now, as the fire service, have until May 6th to review, to learn, to see what they're looking to roll out to us, and then to make public comment before the final rule is in place. And I would encourage you to look at the proposed rule. It contains many changes for the fire service that we're going to get into. We're just going to scratch the surface a little bit on some of those changes and what it may mean to your department and your agency. And again, we're not yelling fire in the movie theater here. We just want to kind of wake you up to make sure that you're aware of what's going on. And I'll just say right off the bat, and I'm interested on Frank's opinion as well as the Chief's opinion. The original 1910-156 law, I believe, was published, and please correct me if I'm wrong, in the 80s. And then again, some revisions in the 90s. A lot has changed in the fire service since then. So I'm a supporter of making sure that some of the standards change with it. I'm not sure yet if this is too much at one time, but I do know there are some changes that need to be made. But this is a lot. It's a lot for us to digest, a lot for us to figure out, and it's going to be a lot going forward. So we're interested in hearing everybody's opinion. So, Chief, thank you for joining us. And I know that you wrote a blog on the Fire Law blog on this on February 15th. And I would encourage anybody that wants some additional information to check out that blog. And that's the Fire Law blog. So thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. And it's an important issue. I try not to editorialize too much on my blog. I try to keep it just meat and potatoes. This is the law. This is what the court said. And once in a while, I'll kind of go off the rails. I'll do my Frank Ricci imitation, and I'll, really take a passion. And Frank, if there's one thing, it's your passion is inspirational. But I'll get on it. But this is an important issue to some extent, and I do want to clarify something. And I read through the regs again last night, or the proposed regulations again last night. I don't think this is going to cause that big a problem for most fire departments. I really don't. If you understand how OSHA operates, you understand that most of the things that are in this proposed regulation, a fire department could already be cited for if you're subject to OSHA. And so I really don't think it's that outside of the norm. And I think these are all things, every single thing that I saw in there, is pretty much meat and potatoes, or right down the broad way when it comes to firefighter safety. And my career goes back to the infamous year, actually goes back to 1972, but the infamous year of 1987, when NFPA 1500 came out. And people were ready to jump out windows, and people were sending letters. Babies will die in their cribs if the NFPA actually enacts this. And of course, we look back at the 87 edition of NFPA 1500 and say, it's nothing. I mean, it's, it doesn't really do much compared to where we are today when it comes to firefighter safety. So again, I really, I think there's a good reason for people to just take a deep breath, actually read it. I've had a number of people call me and email me, text me. And one of my first questions is, have you read it? And they're like, oh, no, I haven't. Like, well, that would be a pretty good place to start before you hit the panic button.
Yeah, here in Connecticut and in my role, I have a very complicated role, I guess, as it pertains to this, right? So I need to understand the standard as far as training at the academy, training that we should be looking at offering to the municipalities across the state, but also working with the state fire administrator to offer guidance to every fire department across the state. Mm-hmm. So being one person, I couldn't go through that and digest that whole document in that short time frame. Mm-hmm. So at the Connecticut Fire Academy, we put together a committee. I have 24 members, every rank from firefighter all the way to chief, volunteer departments, to career departments, that have offered to assist. So we broke out the proposed rule into 12 subsections. Cool. And we are now digesting it. We have a deadline of tomorrow. And basically each committee, they've been working on it for about 5 weeks now. So we started early. How is your section going to impact the academy? How is your section going to impact a local fire department? And what suggestions do you have for the state fire administrator to make public comment? Yeah. And then we'll take those impacts and we'll start working on action items for the academy and also an action item guidance for local fire departments to try to provide that assistance. Because I haven't read the whole thing, but I've skimmed through. I've read some sections in detail. Some I've read more than once. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot to it. But I don't think, my personal opinion, again, and when the jury's still out, we'll see what the final rule says and also what my staff comes up with, that it's not that big of an impact. It could be. It absolutely could be if you're not doing the right thing. But when it comes down to firefighter safety, I don't think we're that far off. And also looking at, there's a phased-in rollout. Right? They're not saying that when this goes on day one, you have to meet all these standards today. There's a 2-year phase-in to meet those standards. So I do think that that the authors are trying to work with the fire service to understand the impact that it's going to have on us, and don't want to just kind of throw it in our face and say, now you're subject to this law today.
Well, I think to really grasp what the changes mean, we got to kind of look historically at it. And first of all, we're going to understand, who does it apply to? And I'm happy to discuss that if you think that would be of interest to the audience. But federal OSHA creates standards. They call them standards. They're actually regulations. They're law, but they only apply in the private sector. Okay, so those, the bloodborne pathogen standard, the confined space standard, and the fire brigade standard, respiratory protection practice, all those only apply through federal law to private entities. That'd be Coca-Cola, UPS, Home Depot, and folks like that. The application of those regulations to state and local government comes through the state. And each state has a decision to make. Are we going to adopt those federal regulations and make them applicable to state and local employees? Some states have done that. For example, Connecticut, your state has done that. My state in Rhode Island has not. Well, they sort of have, but they sort of haven't. But they haven't done it in a way that meets the requirement of OSHA. So technically, we should be following them, and certainly we should be following them. Okay, but there's no ability of the state to come in and issue the kind of fines that they can issue in a state like Connecticut. Okay, so you have that. And then there's a different type of state in addition to Connecticut, which would be, I think the closest one we have is Vermont. There's several down south, South Carolina, North Carolina, where the feds don't even have a presence in those states. The state has totally taken over OSHA enforcement, and the state regulates OSHA. They require both private and public agencies, or private and public entities, to meet these requirements. Okay, so basically, in a state like Connecticut, you have already been required to comply with OSHA even before these regulations were enacted. Okay, now that you might say, well, then how does this affect us? OSHA places two primary responsibilities on an employer. Okay, the first one is, and this goes for whether it's federal OSHA or state OSHA. That's basically the same principle. Number one, you have to follow all of our regulations. Okay, and this would be a regulation. So when Connecticut, and certainly when OSHA adopts this, and assuming Connecticut then follows suit and adopts it, you're going to have to follow it. All right. So that's pretty clear. When OSHA has a regulation, you got to follow it. Okay. That's the easy part. In addition to that, both federal and state OSHA require an employer to provide a workplace that is free from recognized hazards. Okay. So every workplace that is subject to OSHA, in addition to complying with all the OSHA requirements, has to provide a workplace that's free from recognized hazards. So if I'm running a library, what are the recognized hazards? A book may fall off and hit somebody in the head. I mean, what's the recognized hazard? When it comes to the fire department, we've got recognized hazards galore. We've got communication breakdown. We've got accountability breakdown. We've got the risk of going in a building and IDLH atmospheres, and, all of the things that really involve firefighter safety could be a recognized hazard. Okay. Why that's important is that federal OSHA can take an NFPA standard and say, for example, the New Haven Fire Department, you didn't do what NFPA says and someone was injured. Therefore, you have breached your general duty, or the general duty requirement, to provide a workplace that's free from recognized hazard. And that has historically been the position of OSHA, that if there's an NFPA standard, that we should be complying with it. And the failure to comply with an NFPA standard historically, I'm not talking about this law now, I'm talking about historically, could be the basis for a general duty citation from OSHA. Okay. Why is that relevant? Well, if right now your fire department could be cited by OSHA for a general duty violation for not complying with an NFPA standard, what's the difference if the OSHA adopts that same standard and now you have to comply with it? It's the same thing, whether you get cited under, paragraph A or paragraph B, you're still committing an OSHA violation by not complying with an NFPA standard. And so, again, that's one of the reasons why I say it's really not that big a change for us. We still could have been cited for every single thing in that standard that I read. I read it again last night. Every single thing in that standard, you could be cited for today if OSHA comes in and finds that you're not complying with it. Then OSHA will adopt this thing. So now you're not going to be cited under the general duty clause. You're just going to be cited as a regular OSHA violation. You can still be cited either way.
Two things, Curt, just to bring a little clarity to this. In Connecticut, we have a state plan. So OSHA regulates your municipalities and your towns. However, if you're a volunteer department that's incorporated, you fall under federal OSHA, not state OSHA. So there is that one distinction. So for the volunteer departments in Connecticut, they're saying, okay, if the federal OSHA adopts this regulation, now we're going to have to adhere to it. The other issue, I think your legal analysis is brilliant and on point with the general duty clause. I tried to use it and used it successfully and unsuccessfully as a union president. A lot of times it comes down to discretion of the OSHA individual,
Absolutely.
Whether they're willing to go that step to make the connection for the general duty clause. Yes, you're right. It's a violation. It's a known hazard. It's a consensus standard, but we're not going to cite anybody for that here and now. So how a lot of departments are looking at this is it may take away some of that discretion from the enforcement officer, where now it's clear as day that if I don't cite them, I have an issue. The other reason I don't think fire departments should panic is that in Connecticut, and correct me if I'm wrong, but every state plan that I'm aware of, in with the feds, you have the ability to ask them for a consultation, which is a very friendly practice. They come in and they'll actually go through and help you lay out a plan on how to get into compliance. And I found that process to be rewarding and really reasonable. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, and one of the big questions that I have is who's got greater expertise when it comes to firefighting? Is it your state OSHA officials? Is it federal OSHA officials, or is it the firefighters? And certainly federal OSHA has resources that they can call upon, NIOSH and NIST and some other entities. But I really think that we're, again, it'd be like a bunch of firefighters going in and trying to help somebody who's maybe using a crane. We're not experts in cranes. There's people who are experts in cranes. So what you need is an expert in cranes. And that's what happens when OSHA comes in and they're trying to look at what we're doing. They're not experts in firefighting. So they may need to look at, people, and they have resources. I'm sure you know. And, but let's be honest. I think the NFPA, not the NFPA, the IAFF has their fingerprints on this. Okay. And I think that the IAFF has been instrumental. I don't know what committee put this all together and decided what was going to go in, what was going to go out. I think they did a terrific job, but I think the IAFF and possibly U.S. Fire Administration now has had some role in putting it together. I think they did a really good job of picking the most important points out of the NFPA standards, leaving out some of the other things that maybe you're not going to get you're not going to get a big bang for your bucks when you do that. But they pick the most important stuff. And so those resources, I think, are going to be instrumental in that process of going back to the feds, because you'll probably end up getting in contact with the same group of people.
Before I go right and give it right back to PJ, something just came to my mind. In most of those NFPA standards, there's usually a caveat or a line that says something about the authority having jurisdiction. And I'll give you an example. New Haven got Pierce quantums. And if you remember the quantums, you'd open the door and the stairs would come out. So in the city, in New England, you could imagine you open the door and you hit a car with the stairs. So that lasted a week. And then all of a sudden, all the Pierce quantums had no stairs that came out. So it was like climbing a ladder. It actually resulted in an increase in injuries of firefighters getting in and out of the piece. And then the union was able to successfully not get the stairs back on. Chief Grant would never allow that, but all the new pieces weren't quantums after that. So does that authority having jurisdiction, while it's still, if you're going to go that route, you're going to expose your department to liability. Is that caveat still something the department can use if they can actually justify why they're using it?
Yeah, and it's kind of an ambiguous term. And I know I used to work at the NFPA, and we discussed it up there. It's kind of an ambiguous term, because in some situations it may mean the fire department. In some situations it may mean OSHA as it's going to be applied here. And I do know, I'll give you a couple of examples where AHJ would come into play. I believe it's Florida, through their state OSHA, has basically the 2 and 2 out requirement, as written both in the NFPA and also in this standard. The 2 and 2 out requires one of the two people who are on the out to not have another job. One person can have a job. The other person has got to be dedicated to focusing on the safety of the interior team and so on. So that 2 and 2 out. Florida, by statute, amended that, and they allow both of the two outside people to have an assignment. Okay. And I would think that's an example of where the AHJ could step in and say, you know what, we're going to allow the pump operator and the incident commander both to serve as the 2 out when you have 4 people on the scene. So South Carolina did a similar thing. They have believe it or not, back to the 1990s, they have a 2 and 1 out requirement through their state OSHA, but it was a grant through state OSHA in their regulatory capacity to allow 2 in, 1 out. So that, again, it's kind of a complicated formula that they came up with. But again, certainly the authority having jurisdiction does give you some wiggle room on some of those tighter requirements.
Chief, and one thing that we've been hearing here from, in Connecticut, as you know, the primarily volunteer fire service and combination departments, the career side is a lot smaller than the volunteer side, even though we're a small state. Is that, the volunteer fire departments, as we all know nationally, not just here in Connecticut, have a recruitment issue and a retention issue of their volunteers. And now as we impose greater standards, more standards, and now we're putting out a proposed bill that's over 600 pages in length currently, right? How do we expect these volunteers to first understand this bill, say it went the way it is today, right? To get them to understand what it is and then actually be able to put these regulations and these standards in place for the departments. There's a lot of volunteers, and again, I'm sure some of them haven't read it like you started out with. They're just listening to that hearsay or what other people's interpretations are. But what do you say to those volunteer chiefs, those volunteer departments that are already struggling with keeping up with with just like 1001, that the basic standards that they need to, let alone throwing something this at them?
Yeah, I don't think there's an easy answer to that one, and we can address it on so many different levels. I'd like to see the feds come in and provide some support. I've got some friends that are in France, and they have volunteer fire departments, but people who are quote unquote volunteers get paid by the hour for everything that they do, and there's funding that comes back to those fire departments for that. That's at a national level. And, I'm wondering if that might be one of the solutions that might be a possibility. I don't know if all the different factions that would have to come together for that can actually, convince Congress that it's a good idea, but, it would certainly be helpful. Short of something like that, it's a challenge. And I know even in my own department, it's going to be a challenge on a lot of different accounts to get the training. And with limited budget, how are we going to comply with all of the various requirements? It's a challenge. There's no easy answer for it. But, hiding from it isn't the solution either. And I think that, first of all, what's going to trigger some sort of a citation? It's probably going to be either a serious injury or death resulting in some sort of an investigation by OSHA. And, we should be doing everything possible to try to avoid that from happening. When that happens, OSHA will be the least of your concerns. There'll be other things that are much more pressing. So, I wouldn't lose sleep over, the concern about being cited by OSHA. I would be concerned and losing sleep about not doing everything possible to save a firefighter's life.
Agree. And I know Frank kind of alluded to this a little bit also, with the consultations. And I don't have the experience with OSHA. I worked for a small department, so didn't have the issues and the experience as Frank has had, and definitely that you've had. But it always seems that if you're making a concerted effort, not just an effort on a piece of paper, but your agency is making a concerted effort to continue to meet this standard, and you're actually working to it, you have a written plan, and you can show them when they come in that, look, yeah, we know we're not meeting it. We know we fall below the line, but this is our plan and how we've been executing that plan to work towards that. They've been fairly understanding that it's not so easy. Would you agree to that?
Yeah, and I have yet to meet someone who I consider to be an unreasonable OSHA investigator. Everyone I've met, and a lot of times it's been more as colleagues on the scene, because in Rhode Island, again, we don't have state OSHA. We have State Department of Labor, but they don't really get involved in the fire service end of things. But I have worked with colleagues from OSHA at incident scenes where we've got, trench collapses and building collapses and different things. And they've been invaluable. They've been dedicated to worker safety, just like all of us are. So I really don't think that they're going to be the boogeymen when it comes to this. But at the same time, they care passionately about safety. And when they come across a possible fire chief or other officer who is kind of dismissive about what they should be doing, they're probably going to find an able opponent on the other end of the citation.
Frank, have you found similar experiences with your dealing with OSHA as union president, but also as an officer and a firefighter in New Haven?
I've had great experience with federal OSHA and local OSHA. And one of the things that I think is key is if you're a chief or a training officer, reach out to them, have them come down, have a cup of coffee. I've dealt with federal OSHA when we were doing lowering operations of a 140-foot crane in New Haven. We had the area director come out to actually inspect our rigging. And Curt, you'll like this. It's 4 a.m. He came out to inspect our rigging.
The area director. That's impressive.
And he just got the job. He was brand new. And so I was able to convince him that wouldn't it be great if we could get a picture of you being lowered by the New Haven Fire Department from the crane that you could put in your office. So he agreed to it. And then when he got down, he's given a speech of how he had full faith in the New Haven Fire Department because he knew that the New Haven Fire Department did this 3 times before. And I had to look at him and say, sir, I'm sorry, but we have 4 shifts. This is their first time they've ever done this. And the only reason we lowered you is I didn't want you looking at my rigging.
Wow.
But no, in all honesty, I've had great experiences with both of them. The thing is don't like automatically think, oh, they're OSHA. Yeah. Have a conversation, talk to them, ask questions, and you'll build that rapport. And I've never had an issue. And I'll tell you one more quick story because I just think it's so funny. So the federal government spent millions of dollars to design a collapsed building in New London for Top Off 3.
I remember that. Yeah.
All the OSHA investigators were there, and I got asked by state and federal OSHA to be the safety officer for the pile. And one of the federal investigators got there, and he wanted to shut down the whole site because rebar was sticking out. And instead of making a scene, I just took him aside and said, do you realize that the government spent millions and millions of dollars to make this unsafe? The FEMA teams are coming in. Their job is to make it safe. We can't shut it down because you got rebar sticking out. There'd be no purpose of the exercise. But instead of being a jerk about it, I took them and explained what they're going to do and how they're going to isolate and just make sure of it. And they're great to work with because here's the thing. You may be a little intimidated by them, but guess what? They're a little intimidated by you because you have that fire department white shirt on. So have a little bit of mutual respect and don't just go start the conversation.
Yeah, I think if we can match their dedication to safety with our dedication to safety, we're not going to have a problem. But if they sense that they're up here when it comes to safety and we're down here, and I think that gets us back to the volunteer problem, where if you have a sort of a chief that's kind of stuck in the mud and is just kind of dismissive of this, is not working towards it, and it's just saying we're not going to do that, then you're going to find somebody on the other end that's going to push it, as far as they feel they need to get you to do it. On the other hand, if you're there, they're here, and you're here, I think you're going to find somebody who's helpful. There may be a citation, but a lot of times there's a waiver that, might issue a $2,000 fine, but they'll let you use that $2,000 fine to buy more safety equipment or for training or whatever it may be. So that, I have not found them to be unreasonable as long as your passion for safety equals theirs.
Legal question. Say you have a volunteer fire department. They got 10 members. They're struggling. They have a member that's been there for a long time. They don't pump the truck, but they drive the engine. That's the guy saying you'll drive the engine there and someone else pumps it. If they have that situation and they look at the driver qualifications in NFPA, does it give them any protection if they actually make a policy that makes a designation that somebody can drive the truck, but they're not to pump the truck unless it's an extraordinary circumstance, and someone else? So to kind of give it a framework so that when OSHA comes in, they're not saying, well, this guy doesn't have his driving qualification when he's 65 and he's been driving the truck just to get it to the scene for the volunteers for the last 20 years. Would it make sense to delineate that in a policy? Would that give them any protection?
Yeah, my approach to that is you don't have to have a pro board or IFSAC certificate of compliance with 1002. What you've got to have is some sort of a program that trains you to that level. And it could be an internal departmental program, which means the department training officer needs to look through the requirements of 1002 and basically figure out, okay, it'd be great to have an NFPA certificate or a State Fire Academy certificate, but I got to make sure that my people meet the proficiencies that are in 1002 before I'm going to let them drive the apparatus. Another issue has to do with grandfathering, and I think grandfathering was a bigger issue back in the 90s and early 2000s when we were starting to come along with a lot of the certification programs. But that would be a possibility. If you've got somebody like, for example, we've got people that drive truck for they basically drive truck for a living. They, that's what they do. And to make them go through an 80-hour class on how to drive a fire truck, I think is, unnecessary. But, certainly as long as we can go through that standard and say, no, wait a minute, you did this, you meet that, you did that, you meet that. Okay, you got to do these 2 or 3 things and we can check you off. A department, I think, can do that. There's nothing that I saw in that OSHA requirement that says that you've got to have an IFSAC or Pro Board or State Fire Academy certificate, but you got to have your fire chief's approval on it.
Which would be similar to the current wording of, commensurate with duties. As long as you're trained by commensurate duties and somebody's willing to sign off on that, what sounds like is you would be okay.
Yeah, I would think so. I would think so.
And
another thing on this regulation that's coming up, because we have May, I would encourage people not to be intimidated to submit in departments and training academies. Don't be intimidated to submit testimony. It's simply just write a letter. And, if you could link to a couple things, that's very promising too. And you can post it online. Just note that when you post the document is a public document, and anybody can go on the website and see what your testimony is and what your organization's testimony is. The other thing I'd like to just point out is when you do provide testimony to the Department of Labor, and I've had the opportunity to do it several times, not only from the fire department, but also for the think tank that I work for, is that it doesn't just die. So take legislation, for example. You're trying to pass a bill and the bill doesn't get passed. A lot of times that just dies unless somebody else brings up a similar bill. This type of testimony doesn't die at the Department of Labor because a lot of times we're dealing with different administrations. So if you put in testimony and then that regulation doesn't go through or doesn't come to fruition, when the next administration comes in, one of the first things the transitions teams do is go through. They'll actually have a couple people for the Department of Labor to go through all of the past testimony and regulations to see if the new administration wants to bring it forward. So it's not like you just put it in. If it doesn't happen, okay, it's over. Somebody will be looking at that when the administrations change.
Yeah. And that's a good point. This particular bill or this particular regulation was in the early stages of development back when I was with the NFPA in 2010. They were referring to it as NFPA 1500 Light. That was actually the acronym they were using for it, NFPA 1500 Light. But it almost surfaced, I think, back in 2015 again, and now it's front and center once again. So this is not new, and I think all of those things that you just mentioned are still relevant.
Yeah, and Curt, I've heard the same thing, that this is not new. This is something they've been working on for quite a while. Yeah. And if you take the time to go through it, you'll realize that it's taken them a long time to get it to this level. Mm-hmm. So, somebody made a comment to me at work, it's none of it's going to go through. My reply was, they have way too much time and money invested for none of it to not go through. Yeah. Something part of this is going to go
and who knows? I mean, maybe this particular one won't, but then, we'll see it again in a couple of years. But, it's not crazy stuff. There's not crazy stuff in it. Is it going to cost more? Is it going to be more burdensome? Yes, but it's not crazy stuff. I didn't see anything in there that I said, boy, this is ridiculous. So,
but I think we need some foresight for department chiefs and leaders to say, this right now is an unfunded mandate, and we
Yeah.
ideally don't want to do the authority having jurisdiction. We want people to go to the Connecticut Fire Academy, the Rhode Island Fire
Absolutely.
Academy, and be
Absolutely.
confident and get those certifications. So we need to do some budget justification with this. So this is an opportunity to not just look at this in a vacuum. And if you're advocating for your organization, this is a way to help justify your budget to say this is coming through. And ideally, we want people to have certifications.
Yeah, and we should also talk about the volunteer aspect, because there's quite a bit in the regulation, or the sort of the preamble, the preface to the regulation, that talks about volunteers. So they are obviously anticipating some pushback from the volunteers. And my understanding is not consistent with what I saw in that preface. That preface pretty much said that volunteers are not subject to it. And my understanding is that volunteers are. Now, certainly there's going to be a state-by-state aspect to this, because certainly a state Department of Labor could choose to include volunteers. And some states do. Many states, by either statute or by regulation, do include volunteer firefighters under their OSHA coverage. Federal OSHA is saying they tend not to. But either way, what our goal should be is to try to reduce the risk to firefighters, and complying with this. If you're dedicated to minimizing the risk to firefighters, complying with the OSHA requirements are going to help you along the path of reducing the risk to firefighters.
There may be some value to what you're saying there, Curt, because I sat through a webinar by a consultant who focuses on the OSHA standards. Mm-hmm. And one thing that he indicated was that as a volunteer in a volunteer organization, if you receive any financial compensation through a gas card, through a tax abatement, through an on-call stipend, or any financial given from the department, from the city or municipality, or you're no longer a volunteer.
Yeah.
And that you would fall under this, and that, under as an emergency responder or an emergency worker, I think is the wording within the proposed bill. So there may be some value to that. So if you have a volunteer department who gives their members some sort of benefit, that now they are not considered a volunteer anymore, for that loophole of that volunteers aren't covered in this.
Well, when I wrote my first book on legal issues, I met with several area directors and did as much as I could when it came to understanding OSHA, because I had I had a sort of a pretty good foundation, but I really felt like I needed to invest quite a bit of research time in that, and I did. And the conclusion that I had, and this was, I think I was working on that book back in 2003, 2004. So that will date my research on it. But their position was that if someone is part of an organized volunteer force, such as, in the example they used, was a candy striper at a hospital. Okay, somebody who's there volunteering, maybe associated with a nursing program or some sort of volunteer activity to give them some work-related exposure, but they are not getting paid, but they're candy stripers that go into a hospital wearing a uniform and all that, that OSHA considers them to be employees because they are subject to the control of the hospital. Okay, so that volunteers like that would be considered subject to OSHA regulations. So that was back in 2004. That is contradicted by what I saw in the preface to these regulations. And they said that volunteers are not subject to OSHA. So I'm a little bit confused about that. And I'm sure going forward, we'll probably get some more clarity on that. But the way that my understanding back in 2003, 2004 would apply to firefighters, this is exactly how the OSHA administrators explained it to me. If you have someone who is on your roster as a volunteer, OSHA will consider them to be an employee. If you have someone, let's say you have a wildland fire and someone just sort of self-deploys, they're not on your roster. Maybe they used to be or whatever, but they're not on your roster, but they self-deploy. They would not be subject to OSHA. Okay, so that's how OSHA would look at it. Now, that is contradicted again by what I saw in that in the preface to that regulation, the proposed regulation.
The preference for the regulation or the preamble, like you said, could that be viewed as like dicta because it's not in the actual regulation, or
which side am I on? Which side do you want me to argue?
Okay, so you could go either way.
Okay. So, but certainly it would be relevant to the discussion.
So what advice do you have for departments and individuals at this point? Obviously we can't cover all 600 pages or so of the document, nor would we be doing any department justice, right? Because we do need to encourage them to be.
We couldn't keep them awake. We couldn't keep them awake trying to go through the whole thing. That's the challenge. I think that this. Whether this goes through or doesn't go through, this is a pretty good blueprint for where we should be headed. And departments should recognize that. I like the idea, PJ, that you've got a committee working on it. I'm a big supporter of consensus approach to policy setting, and using a committee is the ideal way to do it. You divide and conquer, get those people motivated, get them working on those issues there. And I think fire departments should be taking a look at this. Don't just, go running around like your hair's on fire. Really spend the time, divide it up. There's a lot there, but basically get into it. Say, how much of this are we already complying with? How much with a little bit of work we can comply with, and then how much of it is really it's beyond what we can do, and then start to put together some plans for how are we going to meet this. Maybe not today, but in a year, 5 years, 10 years, put together that plan. I think that kind of ties in with what you were talking about also, in that at some point in the future, if there was some sort of an OSHA problem, we can show them, here's our blueprint. We can't manufacture money. We can do a lot of things. We can't manufacture money, and we can't overnight figure out how we're going to comply with this. But here's our roadmap for doing it.
Yeah, and I would encourage departments to read it, take their time, digest it, divide it, and also make public comment. But one thing Dr. Lori Murrell has been telling us is this one voice. Having this one voice from the fire service. I think there's some value in that from departments and agencies also, to put your resources into your agencies and your constituents and make one statement. Like, the Connecticut Fire Academy, we will provide the state fire administrator with our suggestions and let him make one statement for all of us, versus having 10, 15, 20 different comments that may not be maybe a little disorganized and kind of fractured. We can put one statement together from our agency. I think there's value in that also. And departments and agencies have till May 6th, which is not a long time when you start looking how big this is, but yet it is a lot of time to really start focusing on this issue if you start paying attention. And that's what, Frank and I were hoping to do with today's show, is just to bring this to attention, to make sure that departments are aware that this is going on, and to highlight that you should be paying attention to this proposed bill.
Yeah, I think constructive comments, like, maybe they're suggesting doing it one way. If you have an idea about doing it a different way, really constructive types of things I think are going to be more likely to make a difference than just saying, I think this is ridiculous, I think this is stupid. Unfortunately, the common types of comments that tend to come out of our mouths sometimes. You really want to, think it through, offer some alternatives, or if you're just saying this is not a good idea, provide some reasons why, some explanations and reasons, rational reasons why it's not a good idea.
And to paraphrase Benjamin Franklin, the father of the fire service, a committee is the worst form of governance, but if there's going to be one, you better be on it. And I think the brilliance of what PJ said tonight really needs to be kind of taken to heart, because I've seen committees that do nothing and just make things more complicated. But what did PJ say from the beginning? They have objective and they have a timeline, because without an objective and without a clear timeline, it turns out to be a disaster. And he also made it clear that the committee is putting together a report that will go to him, that will go to the fire administrator. So outlining those guidelines ahead of time is what really gets things done.
I'd like to be a fly on the wall. I'd like to be a fly on the wall when that report comes back, because I'd love to. Honestly, I'm curious. I'd love to see what it says. So.
And Frank, I can't guarantee we're going to meet that deadline of all the subgroups, but that we're working towards it.
Well, but you're brilliant. The fact that you had the wherewithal to put it out first is really, really key. So hopefully that report comes back. I look forward to reading it. Curt, you're phenomenal. It's always great to have you on. We're going to have Mark put up links for your books. That way, please read Curt's blog. And I just want to leave with one last thought, because we did mention 2 in and 2 out and RIT, and it's something I do in my leadership classes all the time, is I ask, how many people on your RIT team? And it's amazing how many hands go up and say 2 people or 3 people. And so then I ask for a chief in the audience, and I always get, the hand like this. They're chiefs, but they never want to go like this. They're like this. So I pick out the right person and I say, all right, so you have a line of duty death, and the wife comes to you and says, my husband or wife loved the shift they worked on, and we only want 2 pallbearers to carry the coffin. What would you tell her? And they immediately all say the same thing. Well, we would explain that we're going to have to transfer stairs and we're going to have to carry him, and we want to treat your husband or wife with the utmost respect, and it's going to take 6. I go, yeah, but we're going to have 2 to pull you out of a fire. So yes, in a small department, you may only have 2 to start off with, but your normal mutual aid policy should have other companies coming. So as soon as they get there, you have a real rapid intervention team. Yes, we want to operate in operational realities. Maybe you only got the 2 initially, but somebody better be immediately coming there on that initial dispatch, because everybody wants to come to your fire. PJ?
Yeah, Frank.
2 and 1, Frank, 2 and 1. That's what I want.
2 and 1.
2 and 1.
No, Frank, and we've talked about this a lot, especially, being from a small department that bordered the city of New Haven, a large department. But I have to say that, my old department is making a lot of strides with automatic aid now, which is something that, we both advocated and talked about for a long time. And there's automatic aid from the neighboring departments now. So there are troops now coming. And, if you look at some of our target hazards in this community, it's still not enough. But at least they're coming. They're already in the rigs. They're already in the apparatus. They're moving in that direction. So that's a great position, and we're really moving forward. And I would encourage other departments to begin looking at that, because we can't do what we've always done with what we have. And I don't know too many departments that are adding staff, and I don't know too many volunteer departments that have more firefighters responding today than what they did yesterday. So we need to look at those policies and procedures and make sure that enough people are coming, regardless of what OSHA is telling you. Just the right thing to do for your membership.
That's it for Politics and Tactics tonight. Mark, take us off. DJ,